And if we presuppose that there is such a thing as rights, then the only coherent, I think this is pretty logically undeniable, the only coherent conceptualization of rights we can have will be based on individual self-ownership. And it's like, if we reject self-ownership, then that's the end of our journey as far as rights and morality goes. Like any other rights claim we would try to make, oh, I have a right over this, when I'm rejecting the idea I even have a right over myself, is kind of nonsensical and incoherent. So that's the end of that logical journey. But if we accept self-ownership, then there's a logical journey ahead of us that is objectively identifiable.
Welcome back to Drop the Mask. I'm your host, Jason. I'm very happy to have this next guest here for you guys, all the way from across the pond in the United Kingdom. After listening to him, I think he might be the one true libertarian. And we'll be talking about his project called The Nations of Sanity. Matthew Sands, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Jason. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to me.
It's my pleasure, really. I read through your stuff. It's really good, so I'm happy to help share it and see if we can poke any holes or help extend the reach out to other people. So before we do that, tell me about yourself. Before we get too much into the project, who are you? How did you get here?
I'm just kind of a regular guy. I'm a father, working man, kind of amateur musician.
Nice.
I play guitar. I've got a reggae band. I release some music under the name Sticky Rhythm. So if anyone wants to check out my music, that's the name to search for. I'm just kind of a regular guy, really. Adding my voice to many and putting forward what I think is an important idea.
Absolutely. So what got you to the libertarian ideas? Were you always that way? Did you come from one side or the other, left or right, as we typically talk about in the States, at least?
I mean, I was never really. The way I kind of think of it myself is I was always libertarian, but didn't always put that label on it. So kind of like when I came across libertarianism as a term and understanding what it was, I was like, oh yeah, I believe in that, but already. So I felt like the principle, which I think a lot of people on certain levels at least understand and accept the principle, because it's the kind of principle that we all live by in our day-to-day lives with each other. We treat each other with that kind of respect of the non-aggression principle, and we respect each other's property rights, generally speaking, obviously with exceptions. So for me, it was really just a case of, I used to look at the world and see a lot of things wrong with it. But no, I was never really political. I always kind of hated the whole puppet show, which it seemed obvious to be from an early age. It just struck me as nonsensical. I never understood the whole people ruling over each other, laws being made by people and being different in different places. All of that stuff just seemed crazy from as early as I learned about it. It never kind of sat right with me. But I was never, I suppose if you'd have met me in my younger days, you probably would have assumed I was left wing just by the fact that I was a bit of a kind of hippie attitude, play my music. And I would describe myself as liberal in a kind of personality sense, not in a political sense of liberal conservative, which both terms don't seem to really mean what those words would otherwise mean, But yeah, so I suppose in that sense, but I was never politically left wing. I've never agreed with taxation, for example. The idea that I think the first time I heard taxation is theft was around the first time I kind of learned about libertarianism and started hearing all these terms like non-aggression principle and stuff. But as I say, I kind of believed in those things already. I just didn't have that label, and I wasn't aware of this kind of political ideology until kind of later on in life, till like sort of late 20s, I suppose. I think was when I kind of came across it first.
Very nice. Well, yeah, on the non-aggression principle then, that's pretty central to what you're working on with the Nations of Sanity. I guess Nations of Sanity would imply that we are living in some kind of insanity, right? So you mentioned a couple things, but what do we think is wrong with our current system, our current way of working, and in the law or anything.
Yeah, I'm probably going to be preaching to the choir a little bit with a lot of these things, and I've listened to some of your podcasts recently, and I've heard you
Oh,
mention
thank you.
even the name of your podcast, "Drop the Mask," was somewhat inspired by a lot of the COVID insanity, and that's
Hmm.
one example. But I think that's just an example of a root insanity in our system. Like a lot of the, like COVID is kind of like the symptoms of a kind of root cause, a root insanity, and
Yeah.
and there's other things that have been, like, even people that don't recognize taxation as theft, still a lot of people still see the tax system as wrong, and they see how much they're taxed and all the different ways they're taxed, and most people agree that it's unfair and wrong, even if they haven't come to the understanding that it's outright theft, no matter which way you're doing it. Um,
Hmm.
but so there's lots of elements of it, but the root kind of insanity that I kind of identify is that basic premise of people having the right to rule over other people. The like it seems almost self-evident to me, or at least quite obvious, that the only coherent way we can conceptualize rights is based on individual self-ownership. So there's no coherent way anyone could claim to have right over other people, right to rule other people. It seems like something that should be common sense, and on a certain level it is. But the fact that it kind of stops at government, or it stops at these points, is an insanity to me. I mean, we live under this kind of insane paradigm. And that's why I look at that root insanity, even though there's lots of insanities that come up bubbling up from that. And like I say, COVID was a perfect example, like the lockdowns and all these, and the attempts to kind of mandate vaccines and all of these sort of things, which were
Yeah.
infringements on liberties. But those things wouldn't even be in play if we didn't already live in a system where we have a ruling government that basically treats us like their property, that they can tax and decide what we go in our body, and all these various things that are very obvious violations of our individual rights.
Yeah, that's such a key point that it's like everything that came out of the COVID stuff was just a symptom of the deeper problem. And it's kind of ironic, I guess. I don't know if that's the word, but that it was a medical issue to begin with because we kind of treat medical issues the same way. We're looking at symptoms and trying to treat different things, and we're not getting to the root problem. So you could be deeply unhealthy at the core, and they manifest as like, oh, I get headaches, or I have a lump somewhere or something, and so you attack that, but it just comes back because you're not addressing the real problem. So, to get to the root of this, you talk about the non aggression principle a lot. The name should be pretty self explanatory, I think, but I guess I kind of always took it for granted that that was the case. So I didn't really think too deeply about it. And reading through your stuff, it started to jog a few things. So, can we get to just a crash course on what the non aggression principle is and why is it key?
Yeah, I mean, I'll explain that, and also kind of what the Nations of Sanity project is in the kind of same explanation. Because when I
Hmm.
first introduced this project, the idea as I presented it was, let's make the NAP, the non-aggression principle, the law, through a peace agreement. And the more and more I've sort of been pushing that message, the more and more I've kind of changed it a little bit in how I present it. And now I say, let's define law by the concept of individual self-ownership, because that then preempts the question of, well, how do you define aggression? When people say the non-aggression principle, they say, well, how do you define aggression? People can say you're being aggressive in the way you speak or something if you're,
Yeah.
there's aggression, like most words, can be vague if you're not kind of pinpointing, exactly the context of the definition that you're applying to it. So I do kind of lead now with the concept of individual self-ownership, and then that answers the question, well, what do you mean by aggression? Well, I mean violating the concept of individual self-ownership. That's what I mean by aggression. So if we're having a consensual boxing match because we're professional boxers and we're sparring or whatever, that's not assault. If we're not consenting to a fight, and you attack me in the street, then that is assault. You know what I mean? It's how we define, all of these things. It always comes back to individual self-ownership, and that's kind of like the key point. It's kind of like the root, and it's also the root opposite of, like I said, that insanity I mentioned in our current system. So like the Nations of Sanity project. Now I basically present it. I say, the Nations of Sanity project is based on the assertion that crime, and therefore also law, can and should be defined by the concept of individual self-ownership and established as the terms of a peace agreement. Whereas before I used to say we should make the NAP the law through a peace agreement. I mean, I'm saying the same thing, but I just
Yeah.
clarify that what we're talking about is defining the law, crime, aggression, freedom, rights. All these things are defined by one simple concept: you own you, I own me, and so on and so on.
Okay, so you talk about a peace agreement. This is how this would be implemented. This is not a top-down rulers tell you what the law is. This is everyone consenting, right, to some agreement. Can you talk about more about how that would work?
Yeah, because basically, like the logical progression for this for me has been basically, the realization that the only justifiably enforceable law we could have would be the non-aggression principle, like defensive force, protecting rights. That's the only time that we could justifiably use force against other people would be to, like I say, in defense of violations, defensive force. Now, the problem is with, like, when I say making this law, and one of the things that a lot of anarchists bristle as soon as I say the word law, because they just associate that with government, which is often the case. Law generally has been established through some kind of ruling authority, whether it's a government or a king or a queen or whatever else. But the problem obviously is a ruling government is against the non-aggression principle. It's a violation of that law. So it would be a contradiction to establish the non-aggression principle as the law through any kind of ruling authority, because that ruling authority would itself be criminal under that law. So the only way we would be able to establish it as law would be as the terms of a peace agreement. Like you say, it's not a top-down thing. It's not anybody saying this is the law because I have the right to say what the law is. We're saying this is the law because this is the only logically justifiable terms of peace we can have. And we're basically just formally saying that these are the terms of peace and setting it out in that kind of formal way. But even if we didn't formalize it, one objection I've had from Lark and Rose, for example, is, well, what difference does it make if you do that? It doesn't validate the non-aggression principle. The non-aggression principle is valid anyway. And I'm like, well, yeah, of course it is. But just like slavery was invalid before we abolished slavery, the fact of the matter is it was practiced a hell of a lot more before we abolished it because it was considered a legitimate thing, and now we generally recognise it as a criminal thing, and it's not a legitimate thing. And that doesn't mean it never happens, just like rape still happens, even though rape's a crime generally across the world, but it's not a legitimate thing. There was a time in the world when slavery was like a legitimate thing, and when we abolished slavery, apart from the fact that a lot of it was done under ruling governments as part of their authority, which is obviously a bit of a contradiction, but also, even though, like, for example, Britain outlawed slavery before America did, for example. So there were times when different countries had it outlawed. But eventually there was a world treaty, a peace agreement. Now, this was between nation states rather than individual people, but it's the same premise. They established a law against slavery that was nothing more than an international peace agreement. There was no higher government that was telling them all they had to do it. It was their terms of peace between each other. We won't attack each other as long as we all agree that we're not going to enslave people, and those are the terms of our peace. Now, I'm kind of saying, well, let's do something like that, but instead of doing it between nation states, which are obviously invalid anyway, we do it between individuals, because that is the only kind of valid unit of agent, moral agents who can act in that way. So
Yeah, when people take issue with that idea, I point to that example of treaties between nations. There really is no global governing force. Well, if you ask the United States government, they might think they are, but there really is nobody out there enforcing these treaties between countries. They agree to it. Sometimes they break it. Sometimes they do stick to it because that agreement means something to them. They want to continue to partner with that nation in trade or whatever they want to do, but there's some reason that works, even without a super governing body for the whole world, right?
yeah, because it's like, there's a kind of threat of force, as there is with all laws. There's a threat of force behind it, but presenting it as the terms of peace is basically saying, look, we can live together, we can live in peace with each other, if we go by these terms. And if we violate these terms, then whoever violates these terms is considered the aggressor, the person who started it, if you like, with regards to any violent conflict. And, because this is the whole point of law. It's basically saying this is what you're not allowed to do, and we'll use force against you to stop you, or, in response to you doing it as a punishment, or, to stop you doing it again, or whatever. And my point is the only time we're morally justified in doing that is when we're enforcing the non-aggression principle, when we're protecting individual self-rights. And anything other than that, any law other than the non-aggression principle, is a violation of the non-aggression principle and is therefore immoral, and really, rightly, by any objective law, and that's what I'm basically presenting here, is objective law, it's criminal. And that's what we need to do as, not, obviously as libertarians and anarchists and that, but also as a human race. That's what we need to do, is we need to understand what is objectively a crime, and therefore we can understand what objectively should be law. And that's what our rights and freedom. It shouldn't be about a democracy or a king or a queen or any other way. No one has the right to make laws. Everyone has the right to enforce it, but no one has the right to make it, because what is justifiably enforceable is objectively identifiable. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, let's talk about objectivity. I'm not sure there is such a thing as objective law. I guess it depends how we define it. Because no matter how you write a law, there's always some way to interpret it in a different way. There's a loophole. There's all kinds of things you could get into. But so, what do you mean by objective law? And then is that just the non-aggression principle?
Yeah, well, I would say it would just be the non-aggression principle. And when I say objective, I mean in the sense that, as I say, like, the only coherent way that rights could exist is through the is based on the concept of individual self-ownership. Like, you can't coherently claim to have rights over anything if you don't have right over yourself. So when it comes to like issues of morality and rights, people could reject rights and morality from the offset. Like some people say, well, might makes right, and morality is just a fiction. And I can't actually argue with that. If people want to reject rights, it's a little bit like, I don't know if you know that philosophical thing of you can't get an ought from an is. I don't know if you've heard that. You can't saying you can't get morality from facts. Well, you need a hypothetical imperative or a presupposition to get you from these facts to what you should do. You need you should do if you want to do this kind of thing. Well, my point is the only hypothetical imperative we need to get from is to the ought is the hypothetical imperative that there is such a thing as rights. And if we presuppose that there is such a thing as rights, then the only coherent, I think this is pretty logically undeniable, the only coherent conceptualization of rights we can have would be based on individual self-ownership. Like, I don't know if you've ever followed those logical trees where you answer a question and it takes you in a different direction to like another question, and then you get your logical conclusion at the end. And it's like, if we reject self-ownership, then that's the end of our journey as far as rights and morality goes. Like any other rights claim we would try to make, I have a right over this, when I'm rejecting the idea I even have right over myself, is kind of nonsensical and incoherent. So that's the end of that logical journey. But if we accept self-ownership, then there's a logical journey ahead of us that is objectively identifiable. Like, what you have the right to do can be objectively identified, just like you can a maths equation. With the premise that 2 + 2 = 4, we can work out more complicated sums, and some of them might require a bit more thought, maybe even a calculator, but it is still as objectively identifiable, at least from a principle point of view. That doesn't mean to say there's not grey areas over exactly where you draw lines on certain issues, but the principle itself is objective. Just to give you an example, I think most libertarians are sort of united on this, that we understand that there's a difference between a consenting adult and, say, a vulnerable child who isn't able to consent. So we kind of they're off the table when it comes to certain decisions over like sex, drugs, and legal contracts. So that's very black and white. But what isn't black and white is exactly where you draw the line dividing a vulnerable child to a consenting adult, because obviously there's this blurry space in between where one slowly becomes the other. And it's like, okay, so what do you do about the grey areas? Well, even though the principle doesn't provide us an objective answer to exactly where we draw the line with regards to when a child becomes an adult, what we can do is we can still use the definitions of each to draw what I would call I call it the lines in the sand, but it's basically where we can segregate the black and white from the grey area. So we can say, okay, maybe it's a grey area at this age with this mental, with normal, and we're assuming normal mental competencies here as well, because obviously age isn't the only thing. You could
Hmm.
be of age but be mentally handicapped, so treated similar to a child in regards to not being able to consent and stuff like that. But let's just take that out of the equation and simplify it with the age thing. So what we can say is okay, maybe it's debatable that whether a 17 or an 18-year-old is a child or an adult, but it's not debatable whether a 9-year-old is a child or an adult, and it's not debatable whether a 30-year-old is and what I'm saying is you can bring that down to the point where it's black and white, and then when it gets into the grey area you can say, okay, well, now we can no longer enforce it as part of our objective law because it's no longer black and white. We don't have that beyond a reasonable doubt that we would apply generally to kind of criminal prosecutions and stuff and stuff like that. But what it does do, even though it doesn't give us that exact line in the grey, what it does do is it tells us who would have the high authority in that grey area. So, for example, with age of consent, it would be the parents. Because if you have a child and it's a grey area whether that child can be released to their full, to their own agency fully, and the parents' duty of care that they owe the child, and because obviously that's another thing that comes from self-ownership is our duty of care over our children. They're not our property, but we owe them a duty of care because we brought them into this world. Just like if I pushed someone into the water who couldn't swim and they drowned, I would be responsible if they drown. I'm responsible if my son starves to death because I brought him into the world and he can't look after himself, and until he's of age to take responsibility for himself, I'm responsible for him. But like I say, there's a grey area as to when I can release him from that, and I can't do it too early because then I'm abandoning my my duty of care, and I can't do it too late because then I'm kind of imprisoning him and denying him his rights as a competent adult. But this grey area in between, I get to decide because I'm his parent, and above anybody else, including him, I have that duty of care. I have that higher authority over anybody else. So, for example, if there's an issue of my parenting that's a grey area with regards to whether I'm doing it right, it's nobody's business but mine. But if I stepped over the line into a black and white child abuse, then people would have the right to come and take my child away from me because I'm no longer acting. Do you know what I mean? So, and I mean that's one example of the grey area. There's loads of examples of this. Other people talk about, well, what about when it's like a grey area as to whether you're encroaching onto somebody's like personal space or something like that, when there's not clear property lines and stuff like that. It's like, okay, well, again, that's easy. Who was there first gets to decide the grey area, and beyond that, it's you have your black and white still. You know what I mean? Which no one gets to decide, and the reason why, again, is down. It all comes back to self-ownership. You're always justifying it with the same concept. Because why is it my decision as the parent? Because of self-ownership gives me that higher right than you, who's not the parent of this child. Why is it my right as the person who's standing there first to decide within the grey area what personal space I'm allowed? Well, because I was there first, so I have the higher right to that area that I'm occupying, and that higher right to say, well, this is the area that I'm occupying and I'm doing a dance or whatever it is I'm doing, and you're interfering if you step into that space. Whereas if I'd have come up to you and started doing a dance and saying, hey, you're in my way, you're like, well, I was already stood here. You know what I mean? And it all just comes back to the fact that we all have equal rights over ourselves. So whoever has the higher right to stand in a particular spot and dictate how far their use of that space goes within that grey area, if there is one, would still be governed by self-ownership. Even if self-ownership isn't drawing the line within the grey area, it's saying who can still. So it's still providing us. Sorry, I went on a bit there, but it's still providing us an objective answer. I hope that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, okay. Long answer, but yes, I'm wondering a few things. First, I guess, could you say that our current legal system is just an attempt to identify these aggressions and put them into a specific law so that we have, I don't know, a good idea what to do in case somebody somebody aggresses upon you, right? Does that
Yeah, I
make sense?
mean, yeah, I mean, well, obviously the formalization of what of laws, that's something that obviously I'm trying to do myself. I do think that's important, but for no other reason than at least having everyone know where they stand. But the problem is with our current system of law is it's a perversion of law in my mind. They've taken a lot of things that should be laws and identified things that rightly are crimes, and then they've mixed it with a whole bunch of stuff that shouldn't be considered criminal, and actually the laws against these things are actually criminal because they're infringing on rights. And because they're imposed by a ruling authority which violates the very spirit of the principle that underpins the proper laws. And I know, like, a lot of people on an instinctive level, like if I spoke to like the average person in the street, who's not familiar with like these terms, non-aggression principle and stuff like that, most people, and there are exceptions, but most people would agree with the premise of if you're not hurting anybody, you should be allowed to do what you want. Most people would understand that. But our legal system plays by a very different premise. So even the laws that are valid are still they're still imposed under a contradicting premise. You know what I mean? Like, so, like I say, if we establish the non-aggression principle as law through a peace agreement, there's no contradiction there. We're not claiming any ruling authority. We're just saying it's the terms of peace. No one has any right to rule, but we all have right to defend ourselves. So, that's all it is, and as I say, and it's just objectively identifiable. It's not, rape's not illegal because I said so. Rape's illegal because it's objectively a violation of self-ownership. It's not a debatable thing, so we don't need to vote on it. We don't need a king or queen to tell us so. And then all these other things that are violations of that are quite clearly crimes, in accordance with that. So that's the problem with our current legal system, is we have laws that are themselves crimes as laws, a criminal, and we have it all being enforced and imposed and created by an organization that is itself criminal under the proper spirit of what I would call objective law. And that's how I would say that law can be and should be objective, because it can be based on that one simple concept. And if we accept that, like I say, what is and isn't a crime, and I know the libertarians do debate on some issues, and I don't want to sound arrogant on this one, but the fact of the matter is a lot of these issues, one side is simply wrong, objectively wrong. It's not even subjective, so there is an objective answer, but it's a little bit like, and I remember one person said it to me, about, well, how can you say that this is objectively the true when, and I think they used the example of IP. They said, well, libertarians are divided on IP. Some people think IP laws are valid, some people think they're not. And I'm like, well, that doesn't mean that they're not objectively wrong. I might be able to find you a top mathematician who gets a sum wrong because it's a complicated sum and he forgot to carry the one or whatever. And that's not me slagging off that mathematician or saying he's not a true mathematician or anything like that. He's just wrong on that point. But I can say that he is objectively wrong, just like I can say that pro-IP libertarians are objectively wrong. And I can show my work and go through it,
And
to
you
kind
can do
of,
that real quick, because that's something
yeah.
that took me a while to come around on. But now I'm on the side that, yeah, IP is not a thing. It shouldn't
Yeah,
be enforced.
I mean, well, the simplest ways I think about it is, I mean, for one thing, intellectual property is a little bit of a linguistic trick, because we're kind of begging the question by calling it property in the first place, when it's
Mhm.
not really property. An idea isn't property. And the thing is if I steal your car, you don't have your car anymore. If I quote unquote steal your idea, you still have your idea. I haven't taken anything from you. There's no actual aggression there. And again, the linguistic trickery is in the word steal, because I haven't stolen your idea, I've copied it. Like, if I stole
Mhm.
your car and you don't have your car anymore, I've taken it away from you. If I copy your idea, I haven't taken it away from you, I've just copied it. I mean, the equivalent would be more if I copied your car. I somehow was able to say I had a 3D printing machine that could scan your car and copy it out as an exact replica. That's
Yeah.
more an equivalent to IP. So all of the reasons why we understand theft of property and laws against that to obviously be valid, because you're violating their rights by taking their property that they rightfully acquired, and the aggression is quite clear and obvious. But when we're talking about taking people's idea, no one can own an idea, and there's no encroachment. What have I taken from you? Where's the aggression? You know what I mean? It's like, you released an idea into the air, I heard it, and I said, yeah, I'll have that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And like I say, that's an objective thing. It might take a bit of it's not as easy and simple as, like rape and murder and theft and things like that. Things like IP, a bit more tricky. Things like
Hmm.
abortion, a bit more tricky. But there's still an objective answer. We can still bring it back to that concept of individual self-ownership and
Hmm.
find an objective answer.
Yeah, with IP, I can think of some ridiculous examples. One that comes to mind is I don't remember which smartphone company was suing another one because of the degree of curvature on the corners of the cell phone. And it's just like, really, this is ridiculous. But okay, let's say I wrote a book, right? I put a ton of labor into a book. I put it out under my name, but somebody else just copies it. They get a better publishing deal, they get better distribution. Would that be wrong for them to just completely copy my book and steal it?
Well, I think it would be wrong, but it wouldn't violate your rights necessarily. I mean, the only thing, depending on the specifics of that example, the only thing they might come close to would be fraud if they were actually like for example, if I made, let's say, for example, I wanted to make a Star Wars film.
Hmm.
Disney should not be allowed to sue me, or George Lucas should not be able to sue me for making a Star Wars film. But if I pretended that they made it, like it was their like an official Disney Star Wars film, then there would be a case to answer because you could accuse me of fraud, and I'm defrauding them, I'm defrauding their customers, and all the rest of it. So, but then that's nothing to do with copyright or intellectual property. But with regards to actually just taking that intellectual property and doing what I want with it, I mean, when we say intellectual property, we're just talking about ideas. Like I say, there's a trick in the language with regards to making us think it's something that it's not. We call it intellectual property. That's kind of almost begging the question with regards to the debate of whether it's property, because we're already calling it that. We use the term stealing ideas when we really mean copying ideas. But we use the word stealing, so then we associate it with theft. We're talking about intellectual property instead of saying ideas. So instead of I copied your idea, it's I stole your intellectual property. So that feels like the same as stealing your car because I stole your property. But if I
Hmm.
said I copied your car or I copied your house, I built a house exactly the same as yours, you'd be like, okay, you're not going to phone the police on me for that. You know what I mean? But it's like, okay, well, if I, if you wrote a song and then I copied that song and did my own, my own cover, and like I say, unless I made some claim that it was me who wrote it, or some kind of fraudulent claim there, where then you may have some kind of case to make against me. But the simple act of copying, there's no aggression that can be pointed to. And the other thing with the IP debate, I mean, obviously, I'm talking about it just from a principle point of view. And for me, that is kind of where it ends. But when some people like to get to the practicals, it's a bit like the how will we build the roads kind of question. It's like taxation is theft regardless of whether I can answer that question. And IP laws are wrong regardless of whether it's good or bad for like innovation and creation and all the rest of it. But the fact of the matter is even from a practical point of view, IP laws are a nightmare for innovation and creativity and all the rest of it. And so much of what people say will stop happening if we got rid of IP laws, oh, people won't invent things and people that no, it'll be more flourishing because people can copy each other and improve and compete and stuff like that. And if we're worried about certain inventors not getting their due credit, certain musicians not getting their due credit for their creative input at the beginning because their input is earlier on in the stage and they're not there when it's time to make money from it or whatever, then perhaps we should look at having adjusting our societal systems so that we can reward the creative inputs that aren't necessarily seeing that. It's a little bit like I have musician friends as a musician who do broil at the idea of getting rid of IP laws and copyright and stuff because they're like, well, that means everyone can just sell my music and copy my music and stuff like that. And I'm like, yeah. And I mean, for me, I kind of like that idea because it just gets it out there, and that's more important to me than what I don't make money off it anyway. So it's amateur. But and also even on a professional level, I know they make more money from touring than they do. The record companies just screwed them out of all their sales and money anyway, and stuff like that. But also, it's like with a lot of these things, the IP laws stifle innovation because research has to be guarded, because people don't want to share, because they want to protect their copyrights and their IP. There's medical research that can't be done because you're infringing on somebody else's patent. You use the example of the phone. That's something relatively trivial. But when you're trying to develop some life-saving medicine, but it's too similar to an existing medicine and you haven't made it enough of a derivative to get your own, you know what I mean? And it's just,
Mhm.
so stuff like that. So I mean, obviously I lead with the principle, but I do also like pointing out that from a practical point of view, these things are all losers as well, you know?
Yeah, agreed. I think, yeah, economically long term, the idea of intellectual property just really stifles growth and innovation. And even in the music example, like, yeah, you don't make that much money off music and album sales anyway. Like most of the big artists, especially, they make all their money from touring and concerts. So if you want to go see that artist, you like them well enough, then you can support them that way.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
but let's get back to uh, aggression. I think we got to talk about enforcement, right? Because this is one of the biggest knocks against anarchist systems is that who's going to come stop the bad guys? Do I have to do everything myself? How do we approach this?
Well, I mean, the Nations of Sanity Project just says what the law should be. It doesn't dictate how we enforce it.
Mhm.
Now, I personally would be supportive of a relatively centralised public serving law enforcement. Some might call that, well, that's like the police. Where it's like, well, yeah, but it would be enforcing only the non-aggression principle. It would have no other extra rights or powers, because the point I make is everybody has the right to enforce the non-aggression principle, but no one has the right, the obligation to enforce it. They're all obligated not to violate it. No one's allowed to break the law, but no one has to enforce it. You don't have to go around stopping robbers and all the rest of it. Like, there's no obligation on you for that. But obviously, we want to be protected from that. Now, there's different ways we can go about it. We can all have our own private securities that only protect us, or we could pool our resources and have something that protects a group of us, or we could just say, well, let's just have it protect all of us, even those that aren't contributing, because we just want the NAP enforced, whether even if that benefits people that aren't necessarily paying for that enforcement. And I would go for that last option. I would go for that. I mean, perhaps that's that. Like I said, I never identified as left wing, but perhaps that's a little bit that left wing bent, if you like, of seeing value in collective systems. I do, but my only problem with our current collective systems is the coercion, is the fact that we're forced to pay into them, which guarantees corruption, guarantees inefficiency, guarantees bureaucracy, and all the things that are so synonymous with government, they're almost cliches. You know what I mean? So it's like we can have a police force and we can also have private security. There's no, again, there's no, because this is the other thing I had, and I think you mentioned it to me about my conversation with Michael Leibowitz, who's an objectivist. And objectivists, generally speaking, and Michael in particular, specifically, they're similar to libertarians in many ways. They disagree with a lot of things that government do, but they still want to have a government, and they want it for that, for the law enforcement. They say, no, we need government to have this monopoly on force. And one of the points, although I obviously disagree with that, the one point that they make in defense of that position that I do agree with them on, in disagreement with a lot of anarchists and libertarians who they often debate with on this issue, is they make the point that the reason why they say we need a government to have monopoly on force is because they say we can't have all these competing organizations creating laws. They want, like, one body to do it. Now,
Mm.
my point is obviously I agree with the anarchists and libertarians, because I am one, that we should have competing agencies that are allowed to compete for enforcing the law. So, but when it comes to creating the law, I mean, obviously I disagree that government should have a monopoly on that, because I don't think government should even exist as, as a ruling authority, because they should be criminalized. But my point is the non-aggression. Sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. The non-aggression principle is sorry, I'm having one of those brain, when your brain comes to a halt.
You were talking about having a free market in laws versus law enforcement.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. So that's the point I wanted to make. Is the reason why I say, when they say to me, "Oh, well, we can't have all these." The objectivist says, "Oh, we can't have all these different agencies creating laws," and I say, "Yeah, I agree with you," but that's
Mhm.
not because government has that right either. The reason why I don't want a competing agency for creating laws is because no one should have the right to create laws. So not only should government not have a monopoly on it, but no one should have the right to do it at all, because what is and isn't a crime is objectively identifiable. It shouldn't be something that anyone, whether it's a private enforcement agency, whether it's a democratic collective, whether it's some kind of person trying to call themselves a king or a queen. No one has the right to create laws, but we all have the right to enforce it. So I want free market competition when it comes to law enforcement, but when it comes to law creation, I don't want a monopoly or free market competition. I want the law set. That's the one thing that the Nations of Sanity Project is about. It's like everything else is fluid, everything else is up for debate. But the one thing that needs to be written in stone, that needs to be the foundation upon our which any different types of, I'm not dictating how our society should be beyond that, but the foundation that we must have, and that I personally would fight for and would fight against anything that's not this at the foundational level, is the non-aggression principle as the law, is that the terms of peace are that we all have right over ourselves, and that's what defines our freedom, our rights, and what is and is not a crime, and what is and isn't a violation of law. So that's kind of like where I'm coming at it from. So I think the objectivists are right when they say that, anarchists are wrong to think that we can have all these different courts creating laws and all these different agencies creating laws, because that's just all that's gonna give us is decentralized coercion. I don't want coercion, whether it's centralized or decentralized. I want freedom. So that's the point. I think that gets missed by people like David Friedman, who have a conceptualization of anarcho-capitalism that will allow for, things like drug laws and well, if an agency decides that they want to enforce drug laws, then maybe that could happen. And to clarify, I'm not strawmanning David. He doesn't advocate for those things. He's just saying that they could happen in an ANCAP society, because it would still be an ANCAP society if it was decentralized. And I'm like, well, that's not good enough. Decentralized, it's because you could argue that it's sort of decentralized as it is. We've got lots of different governments, and it's not one world government, but that doesn't help us. And it wouldn't help us if we decentralized it further. If we had lots of little mafias or lots of little councils or whatever they are, if they're coercive and authoritarian and in violation of our rights, then they need to be gotten rid of. It's like whether it's one big tumor or lots of little tumors, get rid of them and replace it with freedom. That's my kind of argument on.
Yeah, I think one legitimate worry people might have when you talk about, you say everyone has the right to enforce aggression against aggressions, right? And the non-aggression principle talks about how you're able to react up to the level of the aggression. So whatever was done to you, you can is react the right word? I don't know. But you can respond in kind with an equal force. But that becomes tricky. And what if people are just like, well, you beat up my little brother, so now I'm going to kill you? Like, things like that would happen, I think, even though, yes, it's not adhering exactly to the non-aggression principle, but it's like, well, you aggressed against me, now I'm coming at you full force. How would we prevent against that? Is there any way?
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about like vigilantism and stuff like that. And
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, well, the thing is because everyone would have the right to enforce the non-aggression principle, but there's obviously risks in doing so. And and again, when we talk about like, well, how do you define aggression? And then the same answer to that question is, how do you define proportionate or necessary responses that are justified, with regard? And it's all about
Proportionate.
proportionate,
the word I was trying to
or
think of.
necessary. You could argue, because something might not be proportionate, but it might be necessary. Like, let's say, for example, a home invader. I mean, you could argue that it's proportionate to the threat, but at that time, perhaps they're just there to rob your TV. But they're home invading and they're threatening a lot more. You'd be justified in killing them if they were invading your home. Whereas if they would already left your home and they were running away with your TV, maybe your justification for killing them was all of a sudden gone, but you would be justified tackling them and getting your TV back or whatever. You know what I mean? So the proportionality would have to fit the crime, or there would have to be some level of necessity. But it would all come back. It all comes back to self-ownership again. It's all about whether you're violating or protecting. So if you're protecting self-ownership and what you're doing is in service of that, that's why it needs to be proportionate and or necessary in relation to the crime that you're responding to. You know what I mean? Like, generally, enough force to restrain somebody would be at least considered necessary for almost any crime, because you've got to stop them doing it, at least that sort of thing. But like I say, executing a pickpocketer wouldn't be proportionate, and it wouldn't be necessary. Right. You know what I mean? So yeah, I think you just have to play the same thing. Now, again, it's not an exact science. with regards to there are grey areas. Again, it's that drawing that line, but we apply the exact same approach. Okay, we draw our limits of tolerance, our line in the sand. So, okay, we acknowledge there's a grey area, but we draw a line around the grey area and say, okay, well, this is black and white though outside of the grey area. So we still draw our line and our limit of tolerance where we would kind of step in and say, okay, you didn't respond there. But within the grey area, again, who has the right to, who has the higher right within that grey area? Now, with regards to the victim of a crime, the victim of the crime would have the authority within the grey area. So let's just say, for example, let's say somebody murdered, a close one, so you're the victim of the crime because, the actual victim, the direct victim was, is no longer here. So you're the next of kin to that to that higher right within the grey area. And let's say there's this scope, there's the most severe penalty, which could be the death penalty. That would be proportionate to, to murder. But there could also be other penalties like life imprisonment or even shorter sentences and stuff like that. Now, you would have the authority to have the discretion within that grey area of what the appropriate punishment would be. Now, obviously, for something as heinous as murder, there's not much limit with regards to how high you can go on the thingy. Something lower, then obviously there's more of a limit. But the point is like no government or anything that would act similarly, like a voluntary, like a collective or a court or anyone like that, would have an authority in that grey area that's higher than your authority over the grey area as the actual victim of the crime to say, okay, well, this is the this is the proportionate response. They would only be able to, when you're stepping over the line. And this is the other point I'm making with this kind of drawing a line in the sand. It's applying a principle that we already use in criminal law now when it comes to convicting people of crimes. We have that beyond a reasonable doubt standard. That's why people have to have trials and things like that. You have to, because the reason why we have that, and this is one of the few things that's valid in our current law. And like I say, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We keep what's true and right, and we just get rid of the nonsense. But that's one element that we would keep. It's that beyond a reasonable doubt standard that you would have to use the force against people. So that's why. So for example, with the vigilante thing, the one thing that would guard against that a little bit is people that take justice into their own hands. Yes, they have the right to, but they would also have an obligation to do it to that standard. And if they didn't do it, then they themselves would be potentially guilty of a crime and liable to have force be used against them. You know what I mean? So it's like, for example, let's say I shot you dead because I had a very loose evidence that you done something that validly that did warrant that punishment, but I just didn't have much evidence that you'd done it. So I recklessly killed you. Or me and my own buddies, we had our little quasi court and we didn't give you much of a fair trial, and we done the death penalty. Because this is one of the big objections to the death penalty is obviously innocent people getting killed. Well, the biggest guard of that is making the person responsible who would send you to their death, making them criminally responsible if they did so recklessly. So if I sent you to your death or I executed you and I didn't have beyond a reasonable doubt that level of burden of proof that you are guilty, then I've acted with criminal recklessness and I've killed an innocent man. Now, it may not be first degree murder, it might be manslaughter, but it's still a crime. I'm still guilty of a crime. And that would be like, and that's also my preemptive answer to people that object to the death penalty. I say, well, look, if you're worried about innocent people being killed because of the evidence isn't shaky enough, well, the simple answer to that is whoever presided over their trial, the judge, or there'd be no prosecutorial immunity. There'd be no qualified immunity in a free society. There'd be no of any kind of immunity. You know what I mean? The judges and the prosecutors would be responsible if they sent an innocent man, whether it's to prison or death penalty or whatever, they would be liable. That's another thing that we often talk about when we talk about how corporations aren't part of real capitalism, because they have that legal shield that protects them from criminal prosecution. They can kill people and pollute people when no one goes to prison because the corporation did it, and that's their shield. There'd be none of that. That's the thing. People can still have groups and collectives, but from a law point of view, they're all just individuals, and they don't have any more rights, and they don't have any immunities or protections. They do something criminal, they're guilty of that crime. And if you prosecute somebody else for a crime they didn't commit on flimsy evidence, then you're yourself guilty of a crime. So this is the thing. There's a kind of self-policing kind of element at play, which is similar to the kind of free market principles that we often espouse when people say, well, how are you going to stop monopolies in this area and that area? The freedom for people to compete, the freedom for people to be scrutinized under others would be there. And if there's some kind of kangaroo court that's going around executing people on flimsy evidence, it won't be long before we can get the better run courts and the ones that are doing it properly to arrest those people and make them face, no one will be above the law, because the law will be these universal terms of peace that, like I say, everyone would have the right to enforce, but nobody would have the right to violate or the right to impose, like their own laws. It would all have to be done based on that. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a good point. Let's take it back to a philosophical level. How do we know even what is right, what is wrong? I guess this kind of goes back to defining what an aggression is, but we kind of know the big ones, right? Like murder, theft, rape. Those are all very obviously bad aggressions. I think 99.99% of people and 100% of people who are cognitively aware and healthy would agree that those are wrong. But for other things, like things we kind of find icky, but it's kind of a gray area, what's the moral basis for right and wrong?
Well, I mean, for me, there's two types of morality. There's objective and subjective morality. Now, there's the objective morality that I've already laid out based on rights and the fact that it's the only coherent way to have rights. So from that point of view, and it's a little bit going back to that is ought problem. I can't tell you there is such a thing as right and wrong, but I can tell you that if there is such a thing as right and wrong, that's definitely wrong. And I can say that when it comes to rights. That's the objective morality based on self-ownership. I can say objectively, like you say, rape, murder, and all the rest of it. But then there's also subjective morality. Like, for example, if you see an old lady trying to cross the street and struggling, your subjective morality would compel you maybe to help her across the street. But there's no objective morality behind that. There's no objective reason that I can say that you should help her across the street, even though subjectively I think you should from my own. But that's what a lot of people would call about icks and preferences. They would say it's not even morality. I mean, I still call it morality because it's still the ought, so it's still a morality for me. But it's a subjective morality. Whereas the objective morality would tell you, well, don't mug her, don't kick her over, don't hurt her. You don't have to help her, but you do have to not interfere with her, so it's kind of like there's those two levels of morality. So when it comes to the conversation of rights and right and wrong in this respect, when it comes to those things, I can say that they are objectively right and wrong based on that objective morality. And for people, the other thing that makes this easy, I think, to sell to people is, like say, most people recognize rape, theft, murder and stuff as right and wrong from a legal law rights point of view. But what they're not doing is identifying the reason, the underlying principle that's the common denominator as to why all of those things are wrong. Like the reason why rape, theft, murder, assault, slavery are all wrong is the same reason, because you own yourself. So I don't have a right to have sex with you without your consent. I don't have a right to punch you in the face without your consent. I don't have a right to kill you without your consent. But if you do want me to do all those things, then that's your choice because you own you and I own me. You know what I mean? So it's like we can, one of the ways I think we can present this to people is to kind of say, well, look, show them what they already recognize for identifying things that are crime, and just say, okay, we'll just use that same, just recognize the principle that tells you what's the difference between rape and consensual sex? Why does it matter whether you consent? Because it's your body, not mine. That's the point. Why does it matter if you consented to me using your car or not? Because it's your car, not mine. It's so, again, I might sound repetitive saying it, but I really emphasize it always comes back to self-ownership. Even before we talk about the non-aggression principle, the most basic root is what the non-aggression principle comes from, which is that simple concept of individual self-ownership. And when we understand that, everything else falls into place with regards to identifying right and wrong.
Do you think that people really want self-ownership? I think you and I do, and that's why we are where we are, why we believe what we believe. But I see other people, how they act does not always tell me that they do want that. They don't want to be in control of themselves. They want someone to tell them what to do. They like being under the thumb of a government. They like the structure. What do you think? Do you think that everyone really does want it or not?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think they do, but I think what you're talking about is something slightly different, which is a slightly different conversation because one of the things I like to emphasize with this, a little bit like we're trying to emphasize the difference between, rape and consensual sex and voluntary trade versus theft and all the rest of it. I think we also
Hmm.
need to emphasize the difference between rulers and leaders. Now, not everybody needs a leader. A lot of people, particularly anarchists, are very independent minded, so they don't really emphasize with that more sheep mentality, if you like. But my message to the sheep is you can still have that. You can have a leader that you voluntarily follow, but you don't get to make me follow him. And that's all we're asking for with this freedom thing. And this is one of the reasons why I get frustrated with the left versus right kind of debate, because they're kind of arguing past each other with regards to what I see as important. Like when people say, oh, should we have, like, we have an NHS in England, like universal healthcare system and like that. Now, the people that are obviously defend that will say, well, we should look after people, and there's lots of reasons why we should have a public serving, free at the point of use. Obviously, it's not free because it's paid for by tax, but free at the point of use healthcare system. I have no problem with that. I have a problem with being forced to pay for it, because the fact that I'm forced to pay for it guarantees that it's corrupt, inefficient, you know, incompetent lots of the time, because there's no incentive for it to be anything other than that. And that's the problem with the left right thing. I mean, even the capitalism versus communism thing frustrates me. If you're a voluntary communist, let's say, and some people will say that's an oxymoron, but it's not really. Communism in its most surface level thing is just that whole idea of each according to their
Their need.
ability and each
Yeah.
according to their need. Now,
Yeah.
most of us operate that way with regards to our family situation already. It's not an inherently evil ideology. It's only
Mm.
evil when you're enslaving people and murdering people and forcing them into doing it. And that would be
Yeah.
exactly the same of capitalism. If people were being forced to trade with each other and stuff like that, and to a certain degree, crony capitalism has certain elements of that. Again, that's it's about, and so much we miss the point. That's why I never say the word socialism. I always say statism when I'm talking about government, because socialism makes it sound like the left wing's the only problem, and statism and also socialism kind of suggests that there's an inherent opposition to these ideas of having collectives and people having these communal societies, and I've got no problem with any of that. Whether or not I personally want to be a part of it would be something that I'd like to decide on a case by case basis. But I'm perhaps got enough of a left wing bent to me that I would be open to a lot of these things, but only in a voluntary paradigm. And funny enough, sorry, I know I've gone on a bit, but I just want to tell you this quick anecdote, because I remember I
Please.
had a conversation with a guy who was like a AOC, or he used to be an AOC supporter. He kind of went off her because she felt like she'd sold out, but of that kind of, Bernie Sanders, AOC, a progressive, self-described progressive. And I converted him into a voluntarist, but he was still a progressive. He was just a progressive voluntarist. So he was still advocating for all of the same things, but he agreed and accepted that he could only do this under a voluntary paradigm. He no longer wanted to force people to pay into it that didn't want to be part of it. He no longer, I mean, part of our conversation was me obviously trying to convince him that if these systems would work, they would only work with this meritocracy of these free market principles. But he was totally on board with that. And we were talking about some certain types of voluntary collectives that could, work in this way. A week later, I spoke to an ANCAP and I mentioned this to him, and he was equally enthusiastic about this kind of setup. But he just said that's not socialism to him. That is capitalism, because it's free market, because it's just not a typical traditional profit business model that we usually associate with capitalism. But for him, it's still capitalism because it's just free market, a free market practice, free individuals operating with each other. But because they're doing it in this kind of collective way that's got some of the trappings of what we would associate with socialism or communism or something like that, the progressive, as far as he's concerned, it's socialism. It's just voluntary socialism. Now, an ANCAP would say, well, voluntary socialism's an oxymoron. And I'm sitting in the middle saying, I don't care what you call it. If it's voluntary, then fine. I might not want to be part of it. It might be a rubbish system, but that's fine, because in a voluntary system, it'll only exist based on its own merit, not because people are being forced to keep it alive through stolen money. You know what I mean? So this is one of the. Sorry, I don't even know if I answered your question because I went off a bit one there, but
I don't even remember what the question was, to be honest.
sorry, I went on a bit of a tangent there.
Ah, it's okay. It's okay. It's great. No, good stuff. Really good to remember that people really do want kind of the same things deep down. Even anarchists, when you talk to them, good ones anyway, they recognize that collective action, working together, is vital to making things better, to improving society, to keep innovation going, things like that. So, yeah, it really is the same thing. But when you remove the force element out of it, or when you have the force element in it, you have all kinds of perverse incentives that you introduce, and that really, and you know this, but that really creates the problems that we have today. So,
Yeah, and that's what makes me sad about the state of the affairs, because if I put my conspiracy theory hat on, I would even say it's something that's been intentionally done by the people that rule us. You know, the kind of divide and rule ethos, and they've purposely looked at they've purposely looked at kind of like the liberty movement as it could be, and they've divided it, and they've said, okay, well, we'll take social liberties and we'll let the left wingers embrace that, whilst getting them to also embrace economic tyranny. And then we'll do the exact converse with the right wingers. And sometimes we'll flip certain issues as and when we need to keep them arguing with each other, and stuff like that. I'm not saying, like I say, that's a conspiracy theory that they're intentionally doing it like that. But whether or not it's intentional, whether that's just how it's happened, that is what has happened. And that's what I find so frustrating, because I feel like we could get a lot, not everybody, there's still going to be people that just, there are people that are overtly fascist, there are people that are overtly authoritarian communists. They do want to steal your house, they do, they do want to deny you property. But there's also a lot of people, I don't think they're the majority, I think the majority of people, whether they want to live in communes, whether they want to live in like a more typical free market system, or whether they want to live in some kind of hybridization, I think most people would be amicable to the arguments that these things should all be voluntary and people should be free. And that way, even the communes aren't going to piss off the ANCAPs, because it's still a free market phenomena, if you like, because it's just consenting people collectivizing their property, doing it consensually. No one's squatting on anyone else's property or stealing it or stopping them from operating their lives how they want to do it. There's no forced of anything, because that's what we have today. We have forced, socialism, but we also have forced capitalism, in the fact that there's this forced commodification of things that would not otherwise be, like that whole thing about licenses, where the government takes away your right to do something and then sells you the privilege, sells it back to you as a privilege. You know what I mean? This is, and that's a perfect example of more of a capitalistic bent of the coercion element, but still the problem is the coercion element. Sorry, I went on a bit.
no worries, man. Well, hey, we're up on an hour now. I could keep talking to you for a long time and listen to you, but let's wrap it up here. Tell me again about the project. What are your specific goals here? Are you just trying to educate people at this point, or do you have specific inroads into like a government plan that you're trying to get to?
I mean, my dream goal is to unite first libertarians and then perhaps people beyond that on this idea. I'm a little bit frustrated, if you like, with my fellow libertarians, because I do feel like the idea of establishing the non-aggression principle as the law through a peace agreement it's such a logically undeniable conclusion, in my mind at least. This is why I kind of ask people to scrutinize this, because I feel like this is such a no-brainer that we should all be united on this already. Like it's a disgrace to the human race that this isn't always already the way the society is, but it's also a bit of a disgrace to libertarians and anarchists that this isn't something that we're united on fighting for. You know what I mean? Like, and this is something that's holding the liberty movement back, I feel like. We don't even have a united goal. We don't even have a consensus. And that's something I'm trying to offer with the Nations of Sanity project. And it's a tiny project. I'm a tiny person. It's not, it's not got a big following and all the rest of it. So it's a very ambitious goal. But my point is I feel like there's a certain logical undeniability that if it ever did get enough of a kind of ball rolling with regards to kind of exposure and the more it's scrutinized, the stronger it is as well. I feel like the more people, because at first people think, oh well, that couldn't work because of this, and then once they actually explore it, they realize it could work. And the misgivings that they might have at first, I mean, the analogy I use a little bit, as I say, is I'm presenting this idea, and it's like I've created a vase that I'm claiming is indestructible, and I want people to come and try to smash it with a hammer or blow it up or do whatever they can to prove that it's not indestructible. And the more they do that, and it still stands firm, the stronger it reveals itself to be. And I think the biggest problem the Nations of Sanity has is that it's being led by a nobody like me, rather than more well-known voices who could perhaps make it a larger conversation. Because then as people attack it and scrutinize it and say, oh, well, what about this and what about that? And the answers are kind of not just given to that, but almost becomes self-evident once people understand what we're talking about. I'm not an expert in presenting this idea. As you probably told in here, I've rambled on a bit and I'm not overly concise and stuff like that. And I'm not some famous person or anything like that. So it's missing all of those elements. But I do think the idea itself is solid. And I don't, like I say, I don't want to repeat myself, but I don't understand why we're not already championing this. It's, for me, once we understand that the only coherent right we can have is the right over ourselves, then we're at self-ownership. Once we accept self-ownership, we understand that the only justifiably enforceable law is the non-aggression principle, where we get to that point. And then it's only a hop, skip and a jump to realise the only way we can establish it as law is through a peace agreement. So this is all, you know what I mean? It's like 2 + 2 + 2 + 2 gets us to where we are. And it's kind of undeniable. And like I say, so my goal is to speak to enough, everybody, not just libertarians and anarchists, but obviously my first port of call is my fellow anarchists and libertarians, because I'm kind of saying, hey guys, perhaps we should already be preaching this song already, and anyone who thinks we're not, please tell me why you think we're not. What's the holdback on it? That's why my thing is like, please either support, which would be obviously preaching the same message as me, or scrutinize, which would be picking the holes out of it and saying, oh, well, I think this would be a flaw, or I think that would be a flaw. And so far, just using my own brain, I haven't been able to find any kind of flaw that knocks me off my conviction that this is how it should be. Because like other elements of how society can run, I've got ideas on how it could be, but they might be crap ideas, and someone might have a better idea. But one thing that is undeniable, that no one has been able to shake me from, is that the only justifiable law that we could have that would define a free society is the non-aggression principle, and the only way to establish it would be as the terms of a peace agreement. So for me, this is like, and that's why I call it Nations of Sanity, because I think until we get to that basic foundation, regardless of what our society looks on top of that, we will forever live in an insane world, and everything else will just be a symptom of that underlying insanity.
Yes. Well, I think you've done quite well for yourself telling people about this. It's really good to get back to the foundations of libertarianism. Unfortunately, and I include myself in this, I think a lot of libertarians get caught up in just raging against the system, saying why this is wrong. Oh, you're wrong for doing this, but there's no positive action happening. So yes, thank you for doing this. Everybody go to nationsofsanity.com, right? That's where your website is.
Yep.
You've got a YouTube channel. A lot of great videos there. Anything else you'd like to point people to?
No, I mean, I am on Twitter or X as well, just under my name, Matthew Sands. I can't remember my handle, so.
I'll put it up on the screen for
the
people.
website and the YouTube are the main two. And I just want to say to you, thank you again for having me on. I really appreciate. I mean, obviously, as I say, as much as I push this, the one other thing that I would sort of my message to everybody is to do exactly what you're doing, which is to be open and have these conversations, and like you've got the right attitude for what I feel like I wish that all libertarians were doing, which is trying to come together, trying to see how we can move forward together, because even where we disagree, we can help each other, because we can, iron sharpens iron and all the rest of it. So yes. I really appreciate, I'm glad I came across your podcast, not just grateful that you've had me on, but also just as something to kind of see that other people are doing good work and are reaching out and connecting and having these conversations, because I think this is how we move forward. It's like and sorry, I don't keep going on, but it's like I said, but I scrutinize these ideas with my own brain, but when I speak to you, then it's like adding another CPU and it's more computing power, it's more scrutiny. It's like you can think of it from angles that I can't think of it, just like I can think of it from angles. We've all got different life experiences, and I think the more we come together and scrutinize this, we'll polish it even more than it perhaps already is. Perhaps there'll be some kind of refinement to this idea of, oh yeah, we need to do it, but we need to just do it this way just to get it, whatever. I mean, I've polished it this much, but the more everybody who speaks to me about this idea helps me polish this idea, and on a larger sense of just the libertarian conversation that you're already having with people, I think you're helping do that on a larger scale as well, with regards to helping refine our understanding, and you're kind of fostering this kind of environment of productive, good faith conversation. So yeah, I would encourage people to follow your lead in doing that, and I really appreciate you helping me be part of that as well.
Thank you, man. It's been my pleasure. Very much appreciate you reaching out. I would love to do this again. I really like these foundational ideas and people that are just trying to make something happen. Like I said, a lot of libertarians don't do that. And so when somebody is like yourself, I very much appreciate it. So again, thanks for coming on. Thank you, Matthew. And thank you, everybody, for watching. See you next time.